I think we've had a very good discussion in a fairly brief space, starting from Finance Minister Dr. PTR's questions and issues he flagged. I think he got it exactly right about raising the question of how independent are our media, government's use of carrot and stick, in particular the central government, but there are also state governments which do it, for example, in Uttar Pradesh. And then also focusing on the destabilization of the media environment today, which is obvious, in a state of flux, as he put it. But I think it has come under considerable pressure. And then we had some historical outlining and insights and other questions, and also on the state of the media. So I think we've got a good basis for a discussion, which perhaps can be later elaborated in some papers and so on, because I think this forum can also contribute to bringing out good material, reading material, documentation, analysis, insights that would help, not just discussions on Zoom and so on. But this is a very good start. So thank you for that. I don't want to go over the same ground, but perhaps draw from this. I think it's obvious that you can't see the media, the news media, in isolation from the larger context. Everybody is on board with that. And this context is political, social, and also political economy developments. So one cannot avoid calling attention to the rise of authoritarianism. Not authoritarianism in the abstract, because sometimes people talk about the media during the emergency and now. I think it's a mistake to even attempt that kind of comparison, because the environment is totally different. The forces, the formations are totally different, and the dominant players are totally different. So it's not very useful. It would even be called a category mistake, a category error, to attempt that comparison. But we are familiar with what happened before, another kind of authoritarianism, but fortunately brief-lived, short-lived, just 2.5 years. Today it is what can be called the Hindutva authoritarian regime. Let's not shy away from this kind of characterization, because that's what influences the media environment. Not that it has completely taken over, I think, this environment, but it is an enormous burden. It presses down on it. I don't think we know enough about what's happening in India's diverse media environment in various languages. I think we need to find out, but we know enough to characterize this period as something new and very disturbing. Not just the external threats, the pressures, the constraints, the burdens, but also performance from within. And here I think it would be useful to make an analytical distinction between the state of the media and the state of journalism. The two are related, obviously, closely related, but they are not the same. You can't conflate them. The state of the, as Sukumar pointed out, the second aspect taking over from the 90s, the mid-90s perhaps, the profit motive and so on. So it's clearly that has influenced and to a large extent determined the state of the media, or the news media here. But the state of journalism, although it is closely related to that or influenced by that, is not quite the same. And there lies some hope, I think. A long time ago, this figured in the debates Walter Lippmann had. And Walter Lippmann was very bothered about 2 or 3 things about journalism and the media. The lack of expertise, the lack of competence. He was horrified by the idea that untrained people could put out all this stuff at a time when there was no social media. And Walter Lippmann, a sort of liberal, a somewhat conservative liberal, believed that professionalism would be a large part of the answer. In fact, there's some very fine essays about, I think one dealing with the media reporting that Lenin was dead. It's quite an important essay. It was co-authored by Walter Lippmann. But I just want to draw attention to the point, raise the question, are professional values good enough as an antidote to the propaganda role and the incompetence of the media? That's a question that needs to be answered. There is some validity to that. I think professional journalism can put up a bit of a stand. Good journalism schools can make a difference. At least you can do media criticism. But is professionalism itself, enough to counteract and to some extent moderate the negative impact of what is happening, what Sukumar and others have pointed to? This, I think, is an interesting question that comes up. So it's obvious that the Hindutva authoritarian regime at the center has a clear strategy. Apart from social media, what they do, enough has been written about it. I think the Modi media, some of the TV channels, the all-out attack. I think no media organization has faced a greater threat and challenge than NDTV. An all-out attempt to kill NDTV using institutions of state. And unfortunately, the judiciary has not done well enough, the higher judiciary, in protecting media freedom and the rights of an organization like NDTV. But I don't want to go into the details of that. But it is clear that it is an all-out attempt to either kill NDTV or bring them to heel. I don't know which it is, but it's extraordinary. But there are also other examples. State governments have also, in some states, attempted to do that, but not on this scale. So I think this is an important determinant of media performance. And one has to remark on the fact that much of the mainstream media has fallen in line. There used to be these, Humpert Wolff's famous lines, goes something like this, about you can't hope to bribe or twist, thank God, the British journalist. But considering what the man will do unasked, there's no occasion to. And I think it applies to quite a few sections of our media, because if they really put up a stand, even the Hindutva authoritarian regime, it's not just the government, it's a whole formation. I think we'll find it more difficult to get away with some of the things they have. So I think this is a point that needs to be noted. What are the roles, what are the functions we are supposed to play? The news media and journalists as a part of it. We don't want, I think, at least in the liberal framework, a somewhat forward-looking liberal framework, if you like, you would list the following: a credible information function. Without that, you can't do journalism. You can't do well, is the belief. Secondly, there's a critical function, which is investigative, which is analytical, which sometimes plays a watchdog role, and so on. That's clear. And if you do these, and then you have, in some way, however weak it is, an educational role on various areas. And if you do these through three positive roles or functions well, you come to something that earlier used to be called agenda setting, which I think is a tall claim, but at least agenda building. You participate in building a virtuous or a worthwhile public agenda along with other partners, not you alone. You don't call the shots necessarily, but you may have an influence. You participate in building a worthwhile or virtuous public agenda, a pro-people public agenda, whatever the term here. And then, of course, you can't get away from the well-known propaganda role. Dr. PTR also mentioned it. If you're in a political party or a government also, I think there is a propaganda element there. But if large sections of the news media, so-called mainstream news media, play that role, as they seem to be playing on some of these questions, whether you look at the Babri Masjid issue, the judgment of the Supreme Court, there was criticism, but see how the media fell in line, or I think CAA was a little different, but these are impressions. I think there was more critical coverage and more coverage of the opposition to CAA, NRC, NPR, and so on. But these are impressions that need to be checked out. And there has been some critical coverage for the farmers' agitation, for example, which is why so many cases have been filed against those who covered it or supported it or tweeted about it or whatever. So I think it's a mixed performance, but by and large, we have failed to play anything like a minimally independent role. And in contrast to this, you have the native digital news media. I really want to commend them for this. Whatever their reach, whatever their business model and so on, they've kept the spirit of independent journalism alive. There are also other voices. It's not just them. There are other voices. There are people who write. There are bloggers. There are those who write in the mainstream media. There are people like A.P. Shah, Madan Lokur, and many others, Gautam Bhatia, and many journalists as well. I see these are voices that are valuable and influential also. So I think there is a pushback against the propaganda, but overall, who can doubt that the performance of the mainstream, so-called mainstream news media is not just disappointing, it is, you could say, even dismal in relation to issues that matter. But can we also not deny that there are spaces for the expression of critical opinion, for dissent, for robust criticism, for condemnation, for expose? Are those spaces all gone? I don't think so. I think there are spaces because India's diversity is a great advantage, and there are and there are surprises as well. I hadn't followed it till some friends pointed out that on the question of the death toll, COVID-19 death toll, about which we had to rely on The Economist coming out with a central estimate of 1 million deaths. That's a central estimate. And the New York Times coming up with another, an independent exercise where they came up with 1.3 or 1.4 million deaths as a central estimate. Why is it that no major newspaper, not the Times of India, not the Hindu, not the Indian Express, has come up with a big picture here? But the surprise is, some friends have pointed out, I don't read the Hindi press. Dainik Bhaskar, the Dainik Bhaskar group has apparently done some excellent reporting on the cover-up, on the reality of COVID-19 deaths. How virtually every state has grossly underestimated the death toll from COVID-19, including the state of Tamil Nadu. I think the new government, I know Dr. PTR is committed to bringing out the truth. He checks out of the crematoria and so on. But virtually every government, I think Kerala has also made an attempt to be more transparent, but otherwise every government is underestimated. And there's a huge underestimation, a real cover-up, the deaths in states like Uttar Pradesh and so on. So there are surprises like that. A newspaper not known to be, leading criticism or investigative journalism, doing this sort of job. I think it's a pleasant surprise. And so we need to discover more such things if they've happened. But the other point is, let's not romanticize the role of the media. I used to do that earlier. I mentioned it in that hard talk that when he asked me about the state of the media today, Stephen Saka, that there was a time I believed, many of us believed, that we were in an enviable position compared with any other developing country. And, that was really, for me, soon after the emergency, when the press came out of its enslavement, when new opportunities opened up and there was some good investigative journalism, some independent voices, we sort of got the impression that this is a renaissance, the press. But over time, I think that kind of rosy picture. It changed for us. But the hard facts are, I think, our freedom of speech and expression. Sukumar has written on it about recent developments. Others have written on it. The constitutional legal structure protecting freedom of speech and expression, and specifically media freedom, is just not good enough. There's no question about it. And I was going back to the Constituent Assembly debates where these questions were raised. As you know, Article 19.2 lays down 8 heads under which by law you can restrict freedom of speech and expression, the sovereignty and integrity of India, the security of the state, friendly relations with foreign states, public order, decency or morality, and then in relation to contempt of court, in relation to defamation, and in relation to incitement to an offense. We have no quarrel with restrictions when somebody incites violence or incites an offense. But on the other things, it's a pretty illiberal framework. When it's not implemented, when, for example, no attempt is made to restrict your writings on so-called friendly relations with foreign states, it looks very liberal, is no problem. But the structure itself, I think, is pretty restrictive. It's just not good enough. And if you go back to the debates of the Constituent Assembly, people like Somnath Lahiri, Damodar Swarup Singh, K.T. Shah, Sardar Hukum Singh, Pandit Thakur Das Bhargava, and others raised these questions. And unfortunately, the majority of the Constituent Assembly decided in a somewhat conservative way. Maybe the environment context was totally different, but today I think this is why so many illiberal provisions exist in the law. I cannot help but remark on the fact that when it comes to 124A of the Indian Penal Code, the sedition law, although Nehru called it obnoxious, the Supreme Court is supposed to have read it down, but it's a very unsatisfactory judgment. And today, if you look at the latest the database developed by Article 14, 11,000 individuals in 816 sedition cases since 2010. And 65% of these 11,000 individuals were implicated after 2014, when you can say the Hindutva authoritarian regime took shape or came into being. Not in the way we see it today, but that was a start when Prime Minister Modi Narendra Modi became Prime Minister. And just look at these data. But when you look up the states where it has been most used, 124A, Bihar tops the list since 2010. Second is Tamil Nadu, the only non-BJP state in this list. And most of it came during Jayalalitha's period, largely in relation to the Kudangulam protests. Then you have Uttar Pradesh, Jharkhand, and Karnataka. These states account for a very large share of the sedition cases instituted since 2010. There are, I think, we don't have to go into the other restrictions which have really been very burdensome. The law of criminal defamation, the contempt of court act, particularly criminal contempt. Some of us have challenged it before the Karnataka High Court, earlier before the Supreme Court. And then you have legislative privilege. The Hindu faced this problem with the Jayalalitha regime in 2003, and there have been other cases as well. So I think the structure of the constitutional provisions and laws have been not good enough, which is without, I think, had they been different, I think we would have been in a different place, despite the authoritarian tendencies we witness today. Then I think there's a very important aspect of denial of media freedom, the rights of the media. This is the journalists murdered. The CPJ, the Committee to Protect Journalists, has done some excellent work, has documented the deaths, the murders of journalists, also those who died in crossfire and so on, in dangerous situations. But we are primarily concerned with journalists who are murdered in retaliation for their work, particularly small town reporters, but not just them, also editors like Gauri Lankesh and others. It's happened around the world. The figures show that 52 journalists have been killed in India from after 1992 to date, of whom 37 were murdered, 14 died from dangerous assignments, and 1 died in crossfire. These numbers are not important by themselves, but CPJ also has this global impunity index, where there's a certain formula. The index calculates the number of unsolved journalist murders as a percentage of each country's population. There's certain qualifications to what is included, but they compile an index where journalists are murdered on a significant scale, and not a single case has been resolved, has reached finality. And the latest index, 2020, shows 12 countries are part of this global impunity index. I'll read you the list: Somalia, Syria, Iraq, South Sudan, Afghanistan, Mexico, Philippines, Brazil, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Russia, and India. And as I mentioned in Hard Talk, India is a founding and permanent member of this club of shame. It's shameful that with the judicial system we have, a criminal justice system that we have, not a single case on this list from 2000 or the past decade has been resolved. And this matter has gone to the UN General Assembly. UNESCO is tasked with monitoring it. And when they write to the government of India, not just the BJP government, but even before that, there's no response. At least some other countries gave an apology or some kind of this. We just ignore it. So this aspect is not much known in India. I think this aspect, the totality of it, but it is, think of a country that claims to be the world's largest democracy, which nobody believes today, but where journalists can be murdered and not a single case has been resolved on this list. I think we can go on about it, but as Dr. PTR said, Finance Minister PTR said, there are some opportunities. There is hope, and we must build on it. The IT rules 2021 pose a major threat. There is also ambiguity who the rules apply to. So when you're talking about the news media or the digital news media, does it apply to? We know that it doesn't apply to facsimile e-papers. If it's just a replica, as they put it, of the printed page, it doesn't apply to that. But that's not what you now depend on. Most of your content, a lot of the content goes on digital platforms. So technically it should apply to those media also. It's unfortunate that there's a division. There's been some lobbying there. It's been reported in the press that this divide has come between us and the native digital news media like The Wire, like Scroll, like Quint, Caravan Magazine. A lot of the content is digital, and so on. So it's not clear who it applies to, but it is clear who will be afflicted with this. It's not an exhaustive list, but we know that who is being targeted. And it has been pointed out, this is a mockery of the concept of self-regulation. If you look at the Levison what the Levison inquiry came up with. On paper, it looked very good, although it's not been implemented. Because they really had problems with their mainstream media, with the tabloids and so on. It came in response to that. And the formula was self-regulation underpinned by statute, that it would be entirely self-regulation. It would have to be certified by an independent panel, and then, underpinned by statute. The media are not totally free to operate outside that framework. That was the idea, but they would do it themselves. Now, whereas here, like the Supreme Court of India, as Sukumar pointed out, you have sitting on top this interministerial committee of secretaries who will sit on top of this of two tiers of so-called self-regulation. One internal, and then the second one industry-wide, but headed by a retired Supreme Court judge or High Court judge. And this arrangement would have to be certified by the government. And then you had the Supreme Court of India sitting on top for them, as though they're that. It's ridiculous. And we know that there are challenges, and I think I'd be very surprised if the judiciary did not strike down at least some parts of it or this. There are several challenges before this, including by PTI and creative persons like T.M. Krishna, The Wire, M.K. Venu and others, and also Live Law in Kerala. I'm sure that I have hope that this will be the current environment. Sukumar drew attention to some hopeful signs, at least some observations from the bench about the law of sedition and so on. So I'd be surprised if they got away with these rules, the government. But let's wait and see. So I think we are in a difficult situation. I haven't spoken about what Paneer brought out, the Reuters report. We know that there's some optimism about accelerated digital development, but we also know that it really depends on print ads and print sales much more. The share of revenue from digital subscriptions and advertising in India is negligible. It's in single digits if you look at the percentage. But maybe there's some hope there, but the media are in great stress overall. The Indian media are very badly affected. I know this from the inside, and I don't know what lies ahead, whether the recovery will bring you to a relatively safe place. So you become all the more vulnerable to acting as doing propaganda for the government. So I think this is where we are, but we hope that the spaces that cannot be policed, the sheer diversity of India, the linguistic, ethnic, religious diversity, and the federal nature of our polity, however much centralization tries to restrict it, will see us through. And we can only hope that young journalists, people who are inspired by Sukumar Muralidharan or Pamela or Paneer Selvam, and also some of us, will rise to the occasion, and there'll be enough support from outside, from professionals like those who have organized this, some very good lawyers and other professionals. I think they need to speak out. So we are in a tricky situation. I don't think we can fool ourselves and say that the media are truly independent and they'll come out of it and professional values will triumph and so on. But we are where we are. And I think everyone is on the same page so far as this is concerned. I think there is some hope and a lot of anxiety. Thank you.